The drive into town was uneventful, but the isolation of the countryside pressed on me more with every passing mile. I had taken the assignment from the magazine on a whim, looking for something different from the usual fast-paced urban reporting. A remote farming town in the middle of nowhere seemed like a good way to unwind, or so I thought. I didn't anticipate that the silence would have such a weight to it. I'd been a journalist for over a decade, mostly covering political scandals, city crime, and occasionally dipping my toes into feature stories that offered a respite from the chaos. This time, it was something altogether different. I was sent to investigate the strange customs and superstitions of this remote town that most people had never even heard of. The road leading into the town was long and narrow, cutting through endless fields of corn. The stalks stretched toward the sky, their tops swaying gently in the breeze. I rolled down the car window to let in some fresh air, but the scent was strange. Not the sweet, earthy smell of crops, but something metallic and faintly sour. I tried to ignore it as the first few houses of the town came into view. It was nearing dusk when I pulled into what passed for the town square. A handful of buildings, a grocery store, a diner, and a post office lined the street, each one as weathered and tired as the others. The streets were empty, the place almost ghostly in its quiet. I parked the car outside a small, worn-down inn. According to the research I'd done before arriving, this was the only place in town that rented rooms to outsiders. The innkeeper, a woman in her 60s with deep-set wrinkles and a permanent frown, greeted me at the front desk with a glance that felt more like a warning. "You're the journalist?" she asked, her voice gravelly and low. "That's right," I said, giving her a nod as I handed over my ID. "I'm here for a week, working on a piece about local folklore, strange customs, superstitions, that kind of thing." The innkeeper's eyes narrowed. "Folklore, huh? You be careful about poking around too much. Some things are better left alone." Her words struck me as odd, but I didn't dwell on them. I chalked it up to small-town superstition. I'd dealt with people who believed in far stranger things before. After checking in, I grabbed my bag and headed up to my room, promising myself I'd get an early start on interviews the next day. The room was small and musty, but it had everything I needed. A single window looked out over the cornfields that bordered the town. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the fields, I stood by the window and watched as the wind made the corn stalks sway like waves on a dark sea. Something about the view made me feel uneasy. The isolation, perhaps, or the overwhelming quiet. I closed the curtains and decided to get some sleep. That night, I dreamt of voices. They were faint, almost whispers, carried on a breeze that seemed to drift through my open window. In the dream, I was walking through the cornfields, the stalks towering over me on either side. The voices grew louder as I moved deeper into the fields, beckoning me, calling my name. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch dark, the silence oppressive. I glanced toward the window, but it was still closed. I could have sworn I heard someone whisper my name just before I woke, but there was no one here. I chalked it up to a vivid dream and tried to settle back into sleep. The next morning, I began my work. I spent most of the day speaking with the locals, farmers, store owners, and the few families who had lived in the town for generations. Everyone was polite enough, but there was a common thread in their responses: a reluctance to talk about the town's history or the strange customs I was here to investigate. I brought up the cornfields a few times, hoping to steer the conversation toward the topic of the strange rumors I had heard before arriving. Rumors about the listeners and the town's peculiar rule about silence after nightfall. But most people brushed it off or outright refused to engage. An older man at the diner, who introduced himself as Bill, was the only one willing to talk, though he didn't say much. "You're not from here," Bill said, stirring his coffee absently. "You'll find things a little different in this town. Folks don't talk much about the fields. It's safer that way." "Safer how?" I pressed, hoping for more details. Bill's gaze shifted toward the window, where the cornfield stretched out toward the horizon. "There are things you hear in the fields," he said quietly. "Things you shouldn't listen to." "Like what?" I asked, leaning forward. Bill didn't answer right away. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes still fixed on the distant corn. "Just don't speak near the fields at night," he finally said. "And if you hear voices on the wind, pretend you didn't." That was as much as I could get from him. The rest of the townspeople were even more tight-lipped. I spent the rest of the day wandering the outskirts of the town, taking notes and snapping photos for the article. But something about the place left me feeling off. It was too quiet, too still. The kind of place where you expect to hear birds or insects, but there was nothing, just the constant rustling of the cornfields. As evening approached, I returned to the inn. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the town, and a cold wind had picked up. I stood by the window in my room, looking out at the darkening fields. I couldn't help but think about what Bill had said. Don't speak near the fields at night. That night, after a quiet dinner in the town's small diner, I found myself back in the inn, sitting at the window, watching the dark fall over the fields again. There was something about the wind here, something that made me feel like I wasn't alone, even though I couldn't see anyone out there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the fields, watching, listening. I glanced at my notes from the day. Bill's warning about not speaking near the fields had lodged itself in my mind. As far as superstitions go, it wasn't the strangest I'd encountered, but the way the townspeople avoided the subject made it feel more serious. And then there was that strange quiet, the way the wind carried no sound but its own. It was as if the entire town held its breath once the sun went down. I flipped through my notebook, considering the interviews. Most of what I'd gotten was vague, non-committal responses from the locals, people who, by all appearances, just wanted me to leave them and their strange customs alone. But I wasn't about to leave without getting to the bottom of whatever was going on here. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window, pulling my attention back outside. The cornfields swayed in the distance, their tops bending in unison as the wind passed through. The longer I stared, the more I felt like I could see shapes moving between the rows. Just shadows, I told myself. But there was something about the way the darkness clung to those fields that made me uneasy. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearing midnight. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my jacket and my notebook, determined to investigate. If there was something about the night that brought out the superstition in these people, I wanted to see it for myself. And if I was honest with myself, part of me didn't fully believe any of it. After all, it was just a field. I left the inn quietly, not wanting to alert the innkeeper. Outside, the wind had picked up, making the night feel colder than it should have been for early autumn. I zipped up my jacket and headed toward the fields. The streets were deserted, and the silence of the town felt more oppressive than usual. The cornfields loomed ahead, their stalks swaying gently in the wind, making the only sound in an otherwise dead night. As I neared the edge of the fields, I slowed my pace, feeling a knot of tension form in my chest. There was nothing to fear out here. The listeners, if they even existed, were just a story passed down by the townspeople, a way to explain away the strangeness of the place. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I approached the field. The rule was simple: don't speak near the fields at night. But that rule was for the locals. I wasn't one of them. I stopped at the edge of the field, the wind whispering through the corn. It was almost inviting, as if the field itself was calling me to step closer, to listen. For a long moment, I stood there in the silence, listening to the wind. Then, without thinking, I spoke. "Is anyone out there?" The words barely left my lips before the wind seemed to shift. The rustling of the corn stalks stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. My heart quickened as I scanned the rows of corn, half expecting someone, or something, to emerge from the darkness. There was no response, no movement, just silence. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, feeling a bit ridiculous for letting the stories get to me. I turned to leave, but as soon as I took a step, I heard it. A voice. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Help me!" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice had come from the field, from somewhere deep within the rows of corn. It was faint, almost lost on the wind, but it was there. I turned back toward the field, squinting into the darkness, trying to see if someone was out there. The voice came again, this time clearer. "Please help me." It was a woman's voice, fragile, desperate, against every instinct telling me to walk away. I took a step closer to the field, then another. The corn stalks swayed gently as I approached, as if they were waiting for me to come closer. "Where are you?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. The words felt heavy in the stillness, like they didn't belong out here. There was a pause, then the voice answered, "In the field. I'm lost." I hesitated at the edge of the field, my hands trembling. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to go back to the inn and forget this ever happened. But the voice, it sounded so real, so human. I stepped into the field. The corn stalks closed in around me, their dry leaves brushing against my arms and face as I moved deeper into the rows. The farther I went, the harder it was to see anything. The wind had died down completely, leaving an eerie, unnatural silence in its place. "Where are you?" I called again, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm here." The voice came again, closer this time, just a little further. I pushed forward, my heart pounding in my ears. The cornstalks seemed to stretch on forever, endless rows of tall, looming figures that swayed gently in the darkness. I had no idea how far I'd gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was moving just beyond my field of vision, hiding among the corn. Then suddenly, the voice was right beside me. "Over here." I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The voice had been so close, but there was no one there. Just the endless rows of corn, their shadows stretching long and dark in the faint moonlight. Panic rose in my chest and I stumbled backward, my hands brushing against the rough stalks. I turned to leave, but before I could take another step, I heard it again. This time it was my voice. "Where are you?" The moment I heard my own voice echoing back at me from somewhere deep in the field, my blood ran cold. The exact cadence of my words, the tremor of unease I hadn't realized was there, all of it mirrored back at me with eerie precision. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, listening to the rustling corn, waiting for something, anything to emerge. But all I heard was silence, and yet that voice, my voice, had come from somewhere within the stalks. I started backing away, my eyes scanning the rows for movement, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. As much as I wanted to explain it away, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination, or some trick of the wind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been lured into that field, that whatever was out there wanted me to follow it, to come closer. No, I had to get out of here. I turned and hurried back toward the edge of the field, pushing through the stalks, my heart pounding in my ears. The rows seemed longer now, as if the field had grown while I was inside. The way out should have been just ahead, but the more I pushed forward, the more disoriented I became. The corn closed in around me, the darkness deepening, the whispers fading in and out of earshot, too faint to catch but always just beyond reach. "Help me!" A voice, barely audible, whispered from behind. I stopped in my tracks, every muscle tensed. My breath hitched. It was my voice again. "Please help me." I forced myself not to turn around, not to acknowledge it. I picked up my pace, nearly tripping over the thick roots and dry soil beneath me. It felt like the field was swallowing me whole. The more I tried to escape, the more the corn seemed to tighten its grip around me. The wind had picked up again, and with it came more voices, faint, indistinguishable. But all of them carried a tone of familiarity, like they had once belonged to someone I knew. Don't leave us." I pushed harder, breaking into a run now, the stalks whipping against my face and arms. My mind raced, my pulse drumming in my throat. The voices were growing louder, more insistent, calling from all directions. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. My foot caught on something, a thick root or maybe an old furrow in the field. I went down hard. The wind knocked out of me as I hit the earth. The whispers closed in around me, the wind swirling faster through the corn. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, feeling the pull of the darkness behind me, urging me to turn around. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain in my ankle, and stumbled forward. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, I broke free. I stumbled out of the field and onto the road, the tall stalks of corn swaying behind me like a living wall. My chest heaved with exhaustion and fear. I turned back, staring at the field in disbelief. The whispers were gone, the air unnervingly still. It was as if the field had returned to normal, as if nothing had happened at all. But something had happened. I wasn't imagining this. My hand instinctively went to my throat, feeling for something I couldn't name, something out of place. For a moment, I thought I could feel a faint scratch, like a jagged scar barely healed. But when I looked down, there was nothing. No mark, just my own skin, clammy with sweat. I backed away from the field, my mind reeling. What was happening here? I made it back to the inn in a daze, my legs trembling with every step. The streets were still empty, the town silent as ever. Not a soul stirred, not even at the diner across the street. I slipped inside the inn, my footsteps sounding too loud in the quiet of the lobby. The innkeeper was nowhere to be seen, and for that I was grateful. I didn't want to explain where I had been or why I looked like I had seen a ghost. In my room, I locked the door behind me, my hands shaking as I twisted the deadbolt into place. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. But the more I thought about it, the more fragmented it became. Had I really heard those voices? Had I really been lured into that field? I needed to leave. I wasn't safe here. Whatever was in those fields, it wasn't human. And the more time I spent in this town, the more I felt like it was pulling me closer to something I couldn't understand, something that wanted to trap me. I collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion overtaking me. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers again, calling my name, echoing in my own voice. The next day, I woke to a weak gray light filtering through the thin curtains of my room. The town felt different now, less oppressive, but also more hollow, like I was walking through a shell of a place that had long since given up its secrets. I couldn't shake the events of the night before, and despite every instinct telling me to pack up and leave, I needed answers. I had to know what was happening in this town, why the fields seemed to be alive with something otherworldly, and why no one would talk about it. At breakfast, I spotted Bill, the man who had first told me about the rule of silence near the fields. He was sitting alone at a corner table, staring into his coffee like the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. I approached cautiously, not wanting to startle him. "Bill," I said softly. He looked up, his eyes weary but alert. "You're still here," he said, as if he had expected me to be gone by now. "You didn't listen, did you?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "I went to the fields last night. I heard something." His face paled and he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You heard them, didn't you? The listeners. What are they?" I asked, my voice just as quiet. Bill glanced around the diner as if making sure no one else was listening. "They've been here for as long as anyone can remember," he said. "We don't know where they came from or what they want, but we know they're always listening. They take your voice, your words, and use them against you. And once they have a hold on you, there's no escaping." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But why me? Why now?" Bill shook his head. "They target anyone who doesn't follow the rules. You spoke near the fields at night, didn't you?" I nodded, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. That's how they find you, he repeated, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. Once you speak, they latch on. They mimic you, lure you in, and before you know it, you're lost. Just like the others. The weight of his words settled on me like a heavy fog, thick and inescapable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something just beyond the walls of the diner. I wanted to ask more, but the old man's eyes told me enough. This was a truth he had carried for years, one that had hollowed him out from the inside. Did anyone ever make it back? I asked, barely able to bring myself to form the words. He shifted in his seat, rubbing his fingers together like he was holding something invisible, something fragile. A few, but they weren't the same when they came back. Not really. The listeners. They take something from you, even if you manage to get away. He pointed to his own throat, and for the first time, I noticed the thin, jagged scar running along his skin, a mark that had faded with time but not with memory. They leave their mark on you. Your voice isn't your own anymore. And sometimes, even your thoughts, they're not yours either. A chill ran through me, the kind that seeps into your bones. What do you mean? They change you. Some people come back, and they don't speak at all, as if they're afraid their own words will betray them. Others speak, but their voices sound hollow, like echoes of what they once were. You can hear it in their tone, that emptiness. And some, he trailed off, his eyes darkening as if remembering something too painful to say aloud. Some listen to the wind as if they're waiting for something, waiting to be called back. I swallowed hard, trying to process what he was telling me. The wind outside seemed to pick up, rattling the windows of the diner. But why them? Why does this happen? He gave a bitter laugh. That's the question, isn't it? Why anyone? Maybe it's punishment. Maybe it's just bad luck. The listeners have been around longer than the town itself, some say. They come with the fields, and when the fields grow, so does their reach. The fields, I muttered, thinking about the endless rows of corn stretching beyond the town. Are they getting closer? The old man's face twisted in a grimace. You've noticed, haven't you? Every year they creep a little closer. The fields used to be further out, but now they're right up against the edge of the town. The listeners are expanding their territory little by little. And no one says anything about it? I asked, incredulous. They're too scared, he said simply. No one wants to admit it, but everyone knows. That's why they follow the rules, why they stay silent at night, why they don't stray too close to the fields. It's like they think if they pretend it's not happening, it won't reach them, but it will. Eventually, it always does. I felt the air grow heavier, as if the diner itself was holding its breath. The thought of the fields growing, slowly creeping toward the town like a living thing, filled me with a deep, gnawing dread. Is there any way to stop it? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. The old man looked at me with sad, tired eyes. I don't think so. Once the listeners have marked you, they don't let go. And the town, it's been theirs for a long time now. We're just living in their shadow. I sat back in my chair, the reality of the situation sinking in. The fields were growing, the listeners were getting closer, and it felt like there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The silence between us stretched out, punctuated only by the occasional gust of wind outside. The old man stared out the window, lost in his own thoughts, while I tried to make sense of everything he had told me. How do you live with it? I finally asked. How do you stay here, knowing what's out there? He shrugged. You get used to it, I suppose. You learn the rules and you keep your head down. It's not much of a life, but it's better than being out there, with them. He paused, his gaze far away. Besides, leaving isn't as easy as you think. Once you're marked, it follows you. The voices, the wind, it doesn't stop just because you run. I didn't have an answer to that. What could I say? The town was a prison, but the outside world was no escape. I finished my coffee, the bitter taste lingering on my tongue. "Thanks for the warning," I said, though I wasn't sure it would make any difference. "I'll be careful." He nodded, his expression solemn. "I hope so. But be careful about one thing, kid. Once you've heard them, they don't forget you." The old man's words echoed in my mind as I left the diner. Outside, the wind had died down, but the air was still thick with an oppressive silence. The pale light of the morning sun weak against the gray sky. But the town, the fields, it all felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. The faint rustling of the corn felt intentional, deliberate, like the fields were breathing, waiting. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the unease that clung to me like a second skin. It was just corn, I told myself. But my feet still moved a little quicker as I walked back to my car. I started the engine, the low hum giving me a momentary sense of normalcy. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was only 8:30 in the morning. The sun had barely risen, but already it felt like it had been swallowed by the grayness around me. There was no warmth in the light, no comfort in the day. As I drove back through town, I passed a few people on the street, locals going about their daily business, but no one spoke, not even a wave or a nod. Their eyes flickered to me, then quickly away, as if acknowledging my presence would somehow invite something unwanted. I was beginning to understand the unspoken rules of this place. You didn't speak after dark, and in the daylight, you simply acted like the night never happened. I should have left. Every instinct told me to pack up and drive far from here, but I couldn't. Not yet. There was still something pulling at me, something unfinished. I made it back to my room at the small inn I'd been staying at. The room felt stuffy, the air heavy with a faint mildew scent that clung to everything. I opened the window to let in some fresh air, but the view outside didn't bring any relief. The cornfields stretched out in the distance, dark and looming, and they were closer than I remembered. I froze. Was that my imagination? The fields seemed to have crept closer to the town, like they'd swallowed up the distance overnight. I blinked, trying to clear my mind. Maybe it was just the angle, or maybe I was overthinking everything. I needed to stay calm. But calm wasn't an option. As the hours passed, I couldn't stop glancing out the window. The fields remained there, unmoving but somehow alive, their dark tendrils curling at the edges of my vision. I tried to distract myself, reading, jotting down notes from the old man's story, anything to keep my mind from drifting back to the fields. But no matter what I did, the pull was there, like an itch at the back of my skull. The day dragged on, each minute a weight pressing down on me. I watched the light shift from pale morning gray to the dull orange of late afternoon, and my nerves frayed with every passing hour. The townsfolk had retreated into their homes by now, their doors firmly shut, their curtains drawn. No one wanted to be outside when the night came. And yet, I stayed. By the time the sky began to darken, the air felt thick with anticipation. I could hear it now, the faint, rhythmic rustling of the cornfields in the distance, like the sound of 1,000 whispers carried on the wind. It was almost soothing, if it wasn't for the undercurrent of malice, like those whispers were directed at me. I checked the clock, 6:45 p.m., sunset was coming. I paced around the room, trying to make a decision. Stay, leave. Something inside me screamed to leave before nightfall, but curiosity kept me anchored. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and terrible, and part of me needed to know what was out there. As the last rays of sunlight faded, the shadows lengthened, creeping across the town like a living thing. And then, in the silence, I heard it. Voices, soft at first, carried on the faint breeze that swept through the open window. At first, they were unintelligible murmurs, just a whisper in the background. But as the night deepened, they became clearer, louder, familiar. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was hearing. The voices weren't just random whispers, they were mine. My voice, calling out into the night, repeating things I'd never said. I rushed to the window, staring out at the dark fields. And then I saw them, figures moving through the corn. Tall, thin shapes, barely visible in the darkness, their forms swaying in time with the wind. They moved like shadows, slipping between the stalks, their faces obscured by the night. But the voices were everywhere. And they weren't just mine anymore. I slammed the window shut, backing away from the sight. My heart pounded in my chest and a cold sweat slicked my skin. I had to get out of here. I grabbed my keys and ran out the door, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The inn was silent, abandoned, as if everyone else had already fled. When I reached my car, I could still hear the whispers on the wind. They surrounded me, filled the air, pressing in from all sides. I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine sputtering to life. I floored the gas, speeding out of the parking lot, desperate to escape. But as I drove through the empty streets, the cornfields seemed to follow me. Every road, every turn, led me back to the same dark horizon, the same swaying stalks. It was like the fields were closing in, swallowing the town inch by inch. The voices never stopped, never faded. And then up ahead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The road ended, swallowed by the corn. The fields had overtaken the outskirts, pushing into the town itself. There was no escape. The listeners were coming. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just inches from the edge of the field. The stalks swayed in the darkness, and for a moment, I thought I saw figures standing just beyond the edge, watching me. I had to get out of here, but there was nowhere left to run. I sat in the car, my hands gripping the wheel, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The whispers were louder now, filling the air, echoing inside my head. My voice, calling out from the fields, telling me to come closer, telling me to listen. And then, as the last light of day vanished, I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the cornfields. The figures were moving closer, stepping out from the shadows, their shapes barely visible in the darkness. I couldn't see their faces, but I knew they were looking at me. I couldn't stay, I couldn't leave. The listeners had found me. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the car would start. The engine roared to life and I floored the gas, driving straight toward the cornfields, the road swallowed by the darkness ahead. The figures vanished into the night, and the whispers grew louder, filling the air with their eerie, hollow sound. But I kept driving, faster and faster until the world around me blurred into a haze of shadows and sound. The voices were everywhere now, inside my head, in the wind, in the fields. They called my name over and over, pulling me closer. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The road opened up before me, the fields falling away. The town was gone. The whispers faded into nothing, leaving only the sound of my own breathing in the silence. I had escaped. But as I drove away from the town, I knew one thing for certain. The listeners were still there, waiting in the fields, watching. And they would always be listening.